I'm Pedro da Costa, editorial fellow here at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. I'm joined by Monica de Bolle, senior fellow, to talk about this momentous day, which is the impeachment of Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff. Now, there's been an enormous amount of political and economic drama in the run-up to this event. Is the finality of it, is the overcoming of uncertainty at least a positive development for Brazil?
Well, as you say, there has been a lot of drama, a lot of back and forth. Things have taken on a kind of velocity and speed over the last few weeks that has been very, very hard to keep up with. But overall, I think this will move the country into some kind of direction, which we hope is positive. But I think one main message that we need to get across, and that people need to realize, is that impeachment is not the end of the political crisis. So the political crisis in Brazil will likely continue. It's very much influenced by the corruption probe. The corruption probe is not stopping. The corruption probe is ongoing. There are still revelations to be made. There's still, lots of things that can come out of this corruption probe. There are lots of politicians that are involved that we already know of.
But tell us about what happens most immediately. The vice president takes over.
So most immediately, the vice president takes over.
What do we know about him?
We know that we don't know very much about him, actually. He hasn't been, a political figure that's been much out, he's not an outspoken sort of person to begin with. He is very serious, however, and he has been preparing for this moment for quite some time. So a while back, this was about, sort of late 2015, when things really started moving against the government. He did prepare what was then seen as a government plan. And I think we actually spoke about this in one of our videos. And that plan has really been the basis of everything that he has been doing since. So, he's been in the process of trying to form a cabinet to, basically take over as soon as this happened, as soon as President Rousseff was impeached. So what we know about him is that he's very serious. He seems to be very committed to doing the kind of reforms that the country needs. He seems to be very committed about having the sort of cabinet that is mainly formed by technical people rather than political appointees. But as I said, the political crisis in Brazil may present some very, very, stringent constraints as to how far he can actually go.
Sure. And what are, for President Temer now, what are his immediate policy challenges, over the coming weeks?
So his main policy challenge is going to have to be generating revenues, because Brazil is facing this very, very grave cash constraint and fiscal problem. And the first thing the first order of business actually is trying to get the Congress to pass a tax, which is a very regressive tax. And unfortunately, it is the only thing that's been left in terms of measures, immediate measures that the government can actually take.
And this is, in Brazil, it's known as a CPMF. And
it's known as the CPMF.
It's kind of a retail banking transaction tax that everyday middle class and poor Brazilians pay for even minor transactions. Right?
Exactly. So anybody who has a bank account in Brazil, in any transaction that is conducted with using that bank account is going to be paying this tax.
The government goes in and takes their pay.
The upside, quote unquote, of this sort of tax is that it's very, very hard to evade. Actually, it's pretty much impossible. And so you don't have any tax collection issues with respect to that tax. And in the past, it has been used, sort of in these emergency situations as well, when the government was facing a very big cash constraint and needed to implement this kind of tax in order to resolve its immediate problems.
But always highly unpopular.
Always highly unpopular. It has been, in the past when it was used, it was temporary. So, the government, when it proposed this tax, it always said, okay, this is going to last for 2, 3, 4 years, but then we're going to extinguish it. And it's the same thing, I think, that would have to happen now But again, his first order of business is putting in place a tax that is regressive, that affects the middle class, and is hugely unpopular.
And is there anything else on the tax, on the revenue raising side as opposed to the spending cut side that he needs to do?
Well, he does need to approve a sort of legislation that has been in the works every year in Brazil that tries to de-link revenues from expenditures. I mean, in Brazil, there's a very severe budget execution problem because revenues and expenditures, the way that they work in the Brazilian Constitution of 1988, is that there's a lot of earmarking between revenues and expenditures, and there are lots of revenues that are directly linked to certain expenditure items. So every year, the government needs to propose an amendment to the Constitution, whereby, yes, it's a crazy process.
It's a budgetary doom loop, it sounds like.
It's a doom loop, and it's a process where the government proposes, so this year we're gonna de-link these sets of expenditure, these sets of revenues from these sets of expenditures. This sort of amendment that was due to be passed last year for 2016 was never voted because of the political crisis. So this is the second thing that he's going to have to put on the table.
And is this a constitutional level reform, or is this something that can be done without constitutional change?
Well, this is something that needs congressional approval. So it does need to go through the political process. And again, we are going to have the Workers' Party, the previously governing party, now in the opposition.
Doing their best to
best to halt all of these things from taking place.
And what about on the spending side? We know that Brazil has some problems with pensions. What can he cut that will help bring the budget into line?
Again, everything is very unpopular. I mean, the things that he would need to do, apart from things like raising the retirement age, which in Brazil, Brazil doesn't really have a retirement age, but on average, people retire when they reach 55, which is extremely young. And this has, of course, generated a huge strain on Social Security. So medium term, he's going to have to propose an increase in the retirement age. This is in this government plan that I mentioned before that he was working on and released last year. Secondly, he is going to have to look at how these Social Security benefits are indexed to things like inflation, past inflation, to the minimum wage, which is itself indexed to inflation. So some of these mechanisms are going to have to be broken because unless you do that, you really cannot get a handle on the growth of Social Security spending that's already happening and ballooning.
And to get even more cheerful, we could talk a little bit about the economic backdrop that Brazil is facing and will continue to face. I mean, they're in a very deep recession, the deepest in decades, and that's likely to continue for the foreseeable future. Is that your outlook?
That is. I mean, there are two things here. On the one hand, yes, the recession is still, ongoing. So we still have to see how all of these things are going to come together and, when actually the economy is going to stop its downward spiral and basically stabilize. I don't think we're there yet, and it will be a while for us to get there. But apart from that, there's the issue of unemployment. I mean, unemployment is something that, as we know, usually reacts with a lag to whatever is happening to GDP. And one thing that we will continue to see, even if the economy...
It's already started to climb, right?
Yeah, it has already started to climb quite a bit. It hasn't actually reflected the severity of the economic situation in Brazil. So one thing that I do expect is that even when the economy stabilizes, you will still see unemployment rising. Yeah. And this is the kind of, very, very challenging and difficult scenario that the new president is going to face.
Well, if I could end our chat on a more positive note, I feel like from our previous conversations, while the scenario you've painted is bleak, it's less bleak than the stasis or political paralysis that might have taken place had this impeachment not happened, right? And we had a continuation of that uncertainty that might have deepened the financial morass even more. So if I can find an upside to what you've told me, is that at the very least the impeachment vote lends a finality and at least gives the new government an opportunity to try something new, even if, as you pointed out, the conditions facing them are going to be difficult.
That is a very fair point. And in fact, my own view is, if what I have in my mind, if we had not had the impeachment taking place, if this government had continued, we would have probably seen what we have not seen in Brazil so far. What we have seen in Brazil so far is a very deep economic slump, rising unemployment, and all of the other difficulties that this brings to the economy. But we have not seen a balance of payments crisis. We have not seen a fiscal crisis, of the sort where suddenly the government has to declare that it needs to restructure its debt or something to that effect.
Or get IMF help.
Or get IMF help. So we have not seen any of these things developing in Brazil. I have very little doubt that were this government to remain, that would be where the country would be heading. Yeah. That would be the end game. So
I'm glad we're not heading in that direction.
So am I.
Thank you so much, Monica.
Thank
I
you.
appreciate it.